And so that was the first set of trips. There were not that many.
Okay.
But we didn't meet just with the Department of the Interior. That's one agency. We met with agencies in the Department of that were underneath or with the Department of Agriculture, the Forestry, and Fish and Wildlife were probably the main players in land issues in Alaska. So when we suggested regulation or law changes is later on.
Okay.
For some of the trips. So I went on 2 different types of trips. One of them was, like I explained, regulations.
Uh-huh.
The next one, in 1980, and you remember I worked until 1982, I think it was. No, actually until 1979. The Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act was passed in December of 1980. I had left in the year before in 79.
Okay.
But how that works is it takes time to come up with input for drafting the act. So I worked on that issue, I would say in, say, 76 to 79 would be a good guess.
Okay. So that was, I'll see if I can, I'm going to go back to the actual introduction, because I want to make sure I have this right. So I'm going to say that early staffers like you went to DC to meet with the Department of Interior to work on drafting regulations to enact the new law, as well as agencies like Department of Fish and Wildlife, Forestry, and the Department of Agriculture, who are affected by these new regulations.
Say again.
So that I'm saying that the staffers like my dad went to Washington, DC to meet with the Department of Interior to work on drafting the regulation to enact the new law, as well as agencies like Department of Fish and Wildlife, Forestry, and Agriculture that were affected by these new regulations.
Yeah, so in reality, we went down on 2 different issues at different times. The first one was to work with people to draft regulations. And the other people we met with, I can't remember who it was, but it could have been Don Young's office. I can't remember who else was there at the time, and working with their staff to help us get the work done.
But is that, so in terms of representing your trip, this is just in the beginning where I'm just describing the fact that you were going to DC and these were the people you met with.
Mm-hmm. So those are the different agencies we met with.
Okay.
That we had the legislative aides would need to get approval with and to get the votes to pass. No, this is the second part, to pass the laws, the ANILCA law. Okay, so I got ahead of myself there.
Okay. So this part here, I'm not even close to the questions. I'm just opening up the broad description of you and the fact that you traveled to DC. So later, I'm going to ask you about, I'll ask you specific questions.
Right. This is going to be a little bit tricky in terms of maybe one way to handle it is to go more generic,
Okay.
is to say things like, go back and say a law is written and the law is passed by Congress.
But
And
I'm not
some
going to say that in the opening of my, I have a minute and a half to introduce you. I'm not going to say that in the first minute and a half because we could talk for an hour. So in the first minute and a half, all I'm trying to say is very broadly, there was a thing called ANCSA. My dad went to DC to work on it, on follow up to it, where you're from, your service in the war, and then working for the corporation. And then I start asking you questions and we'll build up to that.
Okay.
So the next part I have is that you were born and raised in Wales and Nome, I guess. You were born at Wales, raised in Nome.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Those are the important parts to get right.
Yeah.
You know why? Because it's the part people understand.
Yeah.
If you get those wrong, then they'll wonder about the, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So then he left to go to college in Fairbanks,
Mm-hmm.
and then served in the Army in Vietnam.
Yes.
He came back with a young family to serve as the very first vice president of land for the Bering Straits Native Corporation.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is where I say, I'm very pleased to welcome my dad, Richard Atuk. So the stuff that I've been trying to work out with you, like that would take me without any stopping and discussing with you. Normally the opening takes about a minute to a minute and a half. So you're just sitting there, and then I say, I'm pleased to welcome my dad, Richard Atuk. And then you'll do whatever you do. You say hi. And then my first question is going to be about your background in geology. Did you know that that was going to ultimately lead you back to the region, that major?
Well, actually, I'll explain how that happened, and then it can be up to you to lead it where it wants. Actually, all I wanted to do was get a degree, and when I discovered I needed to pick a major so that we could have an idea of what the classes would be, right? That's how it works.
Right.
So I said, I like the outdoors. All I want to do is be outdoors. And so I figured that was working for the Fish and Wildlife.
Okay.
And when I saw the you call it curriculum, the list of classes.
Yep.
When I saw that and it called for biology, I guess I had a thing against biology. And so I said, I'm not doing that.
Oh.
So that's how quickly things happen, right?
Yeah.
And,
just like that.
just like that. I said, I'm not taking biology. And so, but I said in my mind, I wanted to do something that I would like. And so it made sense to pick civil engineering.
Okay.
So I declared civil engineering. And halfway, maybe a third of the way through the first semester, I was failing an engineering class. So I went undeclared and dropped that class. And along in that process, I took a geology course. So that's the story of the beginning of it. But when I really had to, so I went undeclared for a while. And then when I had to get to a place to declare a major, still, because you need to, list your courses so you don't waste time, right?
Yeah.
And so I said, I like geology, I like engineering. I saw a combination with geological engineering, and that was my major.
I like it.
You like it? That's how it worked.
Hey, so, I think you should, I think we should just record this as we're doing it now. So is your app ready?
Oh, yeah, I think so.
Okay. I mean, if you're ready, I'm ready. All I have to do is get another glass of Diet Coke and then I'll be ready.
Well, just a minute. Let me see if this thing works, okay?
Okay, you do that. I'm gonna get a Diet Coke.
Okay. What testified? Actually, we
Good.
didn't testify before Congress. Okay.
Okay.
Actually, what we were doing, the Clean Act had. I think it comes out so pretty clear, doesn't it?
It's really good.
The next
Need
step
all of that.
government needs to do is to. So we got.
You got that one. So save that one.
Okay. I have 40 hours left.
Okay, that should be just enough.
Okay. So you want to start over on that?
Yeah.
Opening? Okay,
Yeah.
and I'll just leave my recording on.
Yeah, so you're recording right now, right?
So yeah, let's just go for it, and you can do whatever you want. Do it again or use it or.
I like
Okay.
it.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I've already started recording. So let me just make a note in my notebook here about that. Oh, I don't have a timeline on here. Oh, well. So, all right. Normally I'm going to do my introduction and the editor is going to be able to cut this all together. So this is what I say at the beginning of all my interviews. I say, hi, I'm Debbie Atuk. I'm a Bering Straits Native Corporation shareholder and a portfolio specialist for Skyview Investment Advisors. Welcome to this series of interviews that I'm doing to explore the benefits and challenges of doing economic development in Alaska. Today, I have a special guest, my dad, Richard Atuk, who was one of the early staffers for the Bering Straits Native Corporation, which is one of the 12 regional corporations created by the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And rather than do my regular interview, I think I'm going to just get right into questions right away. So, Dad, you went from being a young man who had served in Vietnam. You were at UAF, you got a degree in geology. You came out of college, you went into the Army as an officer and served in Vietnam, and then you came back to the United States, and you initially were working as a petroleum engineer.
Well, again, that's technical. I was working as a petroleum geologist, but the technical part of it was for BP Alaska.
Okay.
And the technical part was that in that foreign company, they had their geologists doing the work of petroleum engineers as it regards to working on the, I'm looking for words now, approving the wireline logging that went on with all drilling wells.
So that's what you up to Prudhoe Bay.
I'm sorry?
That's what you were doing in Prudhoe Bay. when you were
Uh,
logging wells?
yes, that's what I was doing in Prudhoe Bay. So that was part of it. And once in a while, there would be a new well, and it was our job to do the geological part of it to keep track of where the drilling was in the formation. So it was a combination of some geology work, some petroleum engineering work that U.S. companies do, but that a foreign company like BP had their geologists doing that, witnessing, we called it, witnessing the wireline logging
Oh,
to approve the product or to tell them if they had to do it over again.
that is that's really interesting. It's something that is so subtle, a nuance to your work up in Prudhoe that I kind of had a understanding of what you did up there, but the distinction between working for a U.S. owned company versus a foreign owned company, I didn't follow that there was something there.
Yeah, and this is not unusual in the line of work with regard to land issues. It's why people have difficulty understanding it when we try to explain it,
Right?
because we work in the details often.
Well, exactly. So I want to talk about some of those details. So if you walk me through your career path, then you knew presumably the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act passed in 1971, and then you went home. Did you have a job offer, or how did that work out?
Well, again, it takes the detail. Actually, what happened was after getting that degree of geological engineering in at Fairbanks, when I graduated, I went to work for Pan American Petroleum, which later became SoCal. And so that was about 9 months of doing field geology and the same kind of geology work on the platforms in the Cook Inlet. But then I had signed up for ROTC, Reserve Officers Training. So my time came up for that in October. And
Oh,
so
so you
I
worked
left that.
first, and then you worked first, and then you went and served.
Correct.
Oh, I never knew that until just this now.
so so yeah, that's what happened. I went to work for 9 months. Then I did my tour of duty, which
Okay.
included 1 year in Vietnam. I came back to Anchorage. They had promised me a job. They were good for their word, but they wanted me to go to Denver right away. And right away I said, no, I'm staying in Alaska.
Oh, okay. Because if I remember correctly, I believe my mom told me that you guys drove to Colorado Springs. Does that mean you told them no in person?
No, 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 no. Actually, when we drove to Colorado Springs, that was while I was still in the service.
Oh, okay.
That 6 months of my duty was spent in Colorado Springs.
Oh, got you. I'm learning all these little tiny details. It's all in the details.
Exactly.
Okay, so you said no to them, and then what was your plan?
So I went to I was applying in different places, but at that time the act had passed. Remember, and a fellow named Roy Hundorf was working for a kind of a related Native organization that had some money from whatever their sources were to help people in different ways. And somehow or another, I worked with him to get a what do you call these description of our job, the resume.
Right?
He helped me with a resume, and I think he put me in contact with BP Alaska.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, this is how things work sometimes. And the longer story short, I totally enjoyed that. So I worked there, I think, a couple of years. And then they were talking about sending me to Well, actually, it didn't work that way. They didn't talk about sending me, but I knew that I had been on the job long enough. My next step was going to be to go to some other posting somewhere in the world.
Right. That's how they typically.
That's exactly what they do. By that time, I had learned that, and an opportunity came up in Nome working for the Native Corporation. I took it because I knew I would say no to a posting outside of Alaska.
Okay. And that was at Bering Straits. That's the land
Correct.
job.
Correct. The job
Okay.
was at Bering Straits.
And what was the earliest work then that was on your plate as a new person there at this newly formed corporation in this new area called land?
Well, the Claims Act had passed the year before, I think, and that one of the jobs, the first job to do for a land type person was to make land selections, and for village corporations to make land selections within a 2-year time frame.
Okay, so that was why you were going out to the airport all the time, because I remember we took you back and forth to the airport all the time. So you were traveling to the villages to help them with their land selections. Is that right?
Exactly. There were a number of people traveling to the villages because the villages need to incorporate and have entity that could sign the different things for the corporation, the business requirements. So they needed to incorporate it first. Secondly, they needed to make the land selections, file them with their signature, with their incorporation papers and so on. So I think we did both. We talked to the villages about the Claims Act, explained it, explained the land selection part. Other people in the office also did the same thing, focusing more on the village business other than land. So you can see the overlap of those kind of things. There were 17 villages, if I remember. And so that's why there were so many trips. And it took multiple trips to get all this in place. Later on, we needed to explain land selections, what land they wanted, put it on maps and help them with their presentation and approvals to their members and so on.
So there is a model there for when the regional corporations worked in partnership with the village corporations to assist them. And, you know, for better or for worse, the participation in federal contracting now has created a point of potential competitiveness to prevent the regional corporations from wanting to help village corporations because they might be seen as competitors.
Well, I think that's probably something else we can get into a little later into this.
Okay.
This is we're in right now, and you'll understand the reasons when I get to them.
Okay, good. So I had wanted you to talk a little bit about the travel that you did to Washington, D.C. back in the 70s. Did you want to talk about that?
Sure.
Okay, so my understanding is that the law was passed, as you explained to me. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was passed, but then there's the reality of the implementation. And you traveled to DC twice, and one of those times was to talk to the Department of Interior, and that was to work with them on drafting the implementation of the regulations of the new law. Is that right?
Exactly. So what happened was there was an act that laid out what was to be done by law. But in order to do that, then the different agencies need to have regulations to define how they make the law work. And we call those regulations, and they're often quite specific as to it allows that department to transfer the land, for instance, and how that's done. And there were specific parts that were problematic because the act called for selections to be made in a certain way in the villages with language like contiguous and compact.
Okay.
So, but they didn't define what those words meant. And so in the regulation, and there was a way to limit the length versus the width. In other words, if you had one long, really long, skinny selection, that's what they wanted to avoid. But at the same time, it needed to be brought to earth as to what qualifies as compact, what qualifies as contiguous, which means touching all the time. So those are the types of issues that were worked out in some of these trips and negotiations, also with negotiating with other regions on that language.
Okay. So that means that you were working with various agencies like Department of Agriculture, Fish and Wildlife, and Forestry, as well as other regional corporations.
Yes, because each of those agencies and other regional corporations and their villages have an interest in how this language comes out and what the language actually does and means for us workers.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
I think in the past, in my whole life, these things have been very difficult to explain because people don't want to take the time to talk about regulations, compact and contiguous, and the details of how things get done in land work.
It's really, it's very tricky. And also in the case, and I don't know if we want to talk about this or not, but in the case of revenue sharing that the regional corporations are required to do with their mineral wealth or their extractions, there was some complicated exchange between corporations that led to somehow an agreement where if ANWR is open, then Arctic Slope is not required to do revenue sharing. Were you a party to any of that or aware of what ultimately led to that?
Well, yes, we had to be because, again, the same act talks about 70% of the revenue of different types, including subsurface and timber owned by regional corporations, needed to be shared and left it at that. And there again, there needed to be clarification of what that means, how it is done. And because the interest is of how that's done is solely up to the regions and their villages, that was kind of kept in-house and done by the regions with each other. Presumably, if following the law that nobody else outside of the regions and the villages would really have an interest in how that works. So that was the internal negotiation first, and any implementing laws and regulations were done after that, after the regions, because now there's 12 different interests with each region owning different quantities of timber or subsurface oil or minerals, with some having a lot, others having, and so then another part of that is to define what was to be shared, because as business people know that when you develop something, you should also recoup whatever you spent on it. So defining revenues and deductions was and still is, I believe, a big part of how those formulas are made. So and I want to tell you a little story here that'll help in the process.
Okay.
You may have heard of a person named Roger Lang. And maybe not, but you will later. When we started working on these things among 12 regions, then there was a discussion even at the beginning stages of how to do this. And some of the regional people got into talking about how even to process who says what when. And so long story short, we got into Robert's Rules of Orders. So we could have some kind of process here, keep order and such like. And so the group of some representatives from 12 different places, each one sending 2 or 3 people, were talking about all of a sudden Robert's rules. And Roger Lang said, no, this is our land. This is our resources. Let's not use Robert's rules. Let's use our own rules. And that famous time, I don't know if other people look at it as famous, but I do, is by and large, our people can use our rules first and then deliver what we want and need. So this has been the cooperation among the region that what was needed to make this work. Otherwise, people might still be squabbling about the remainders of some income or deduction.
So you're saying you then did away with Robert's Rules of Order. You can put that down. It has a pretty good microphone. It'll pick up.
Okay.
You put it down next to you. So you're saying that by putting that aside, you took out parliamentary procedures so that you guys can just talk to each other. Okay. That's really interesting. Where did that guy come from?
Where did that come from?
Where's that guy Roger from?
Oh, okay.
No, where's Roger from? Did he work for?
From southeastern Alaska.
Oh, okay.
He was a strong supporter of the original of the Claims Act.
Oh, okay.
So he was very instrumental in keeping us on our track, along with our previous governor, lieutenant governor.
When was the first time you became aware of this Settlement Act in your life? Like, were you in college or did you know about it beforehand? Because people in the Southeast had been agitating for something like this settlement for a long time, right?
Yeah, I was younger than some of the people that were involved in it, the Noddies and the Hensleys and the Malots. So I was in, I think, the early stages of getting an education in Fairbanks when this was going on.
But it really even predates their generation, I think, right? I mean, there's the very famous woman, Elizabeth Peratrovich, right? We celebrate a day in Alaska for her work because the early Arctic Native Brotherhood, that comes from the Southeast, right? And that's all about trying to establish Indigenous claims and Indigenous rights, or am I oversimplifying?
I think so, and I was not a big part of that because of my age, and so I came in just shortly after the Claims Act had been passed, or enacted is probably the better word, into law.
Okay. So did we cover everything that you wanted to talk about with regards to Anilka, or did you want to say more about that?
I think there could be more said about the selection process, first of all.
Okay.
Is that there were villages selected a certain amount of land depending on their population. So even that in and of itself, people had differences within the villages. And so our job was to help them understand this, to help them implement what they needed to, and actually give them information and our recommendations at times to what lands are the best for different uses, primarily of regional interest. But let me say this, that we left the decision, the final decisions, and it was theirs anyway, to file what land they wanted by that deadline. Remember, that was 2 years from the passing of the act to the time they had to file which lands that they wanted.
Okay.
And part of that reality is by the time we started, a half a year of that deadline had passed by already. So we were working really hard within a year and a half. And the regional selections that the regions had special provisions in the Claims Act and also needed clarification in the enacting regulations. So we worked on that. So we saw, I think overall, that the villages and the region were in concert with regard to the importance and value of the land to their future. And I think one of the questions that comes up in the past is, they could have made a money distribution. And I know that as it is today, people are in need of income, and a distribution of equal amounts to everybody that signed up could have been done. And my evaluation of that at that time and now, that would have been long gone and not there long ago by everybody, and everybody would be sitting in their village with the village owning the land and the federal government owning the rest of where they live. And so it's a tough call to make, but I think reality shows in other places, wherever distributions are made, it comes and goes, and we would, I believe, have been left today with villages sitting on a municipal land surrounded by federal land. As it is now, they have some say on what happens to that land. It's particularly important right now with hunting season. They own that land. They can post no trespassing if they want to as a private landowner. That's one of the big places it made sense.
Well, one of the areas that I was hoping we would get to is there's going to be some opportunities, I think, for some of the corporations, the villages around that graphite that's up there, where Graphite One has, I think it's state leases, but I think that the neighboring village corporations that have land are Mary's Igloo Native Corporation and Teller Native Corporation. And I think that they have some opportunities in the way of maybe doing something with roads, having some private use, being able to charge a fee for private use.
Exactly. And as private landowners, having a development occur on or near their lands, they would have a say-so specifically with regard to access and passage through their lands if that's what the business needs to do. So that's a good example of where it makes sense. The other thing is that at the time we made land selections, we could not foretell and foresee where some of the developments would be. We did the best we could with what we had, information we had, to select lands of mineral subsurface value. But it takes a long extended program to find those resources. And the regions and the villages didn't have enough time and money to be the ones in the business to look for them. Although that was possible, that's not the best use of resources. It's better to contract it out or be in control of whether or not it's contracted out. But when somebody finds something adjacent to you, they will want to talk to you anyway in terms of access, as that example you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, that's probably the highest value of mineral wealth that we have in our region, that I know of or I've heard of. Maybe I think one time you said there was another rare earth metal out there somewhere.
There's been, the Sword Peninsula is highly mineralized, but when people talk about these kinds of resources, it needs to be done on the global level?
Well, sure. And this graphite issue is definitely global because right now China is the low cost producer of graphite, and we have growing demand for graphite in the form of the batteries that are going into these electric vehicles. And unless there's, higher tariffs on the graphite out of China, I don't know when graphite one will become profitable to begin actually producing graphite here in the US. It's supposed to be very high quality compared to what comes out of China, but the cost to produce in China is so much lower. It's not going to be, I don't think it's going to be producing for a while.
Right, exactly. And I think what we want to do is have an idea in our minds how that business works on the global scale. That and I think it, I mean, I looked at it a little bit, not enough detail to say that much about it, except it makes sense in like you mentioned,
Right.
the uses and the rarity of this kind of resource. But it makes sense to think about oil, gas, and those large developments because whatever is done there needs to measure up with what else is going on in the world. And you mentioned China. Now, we take the whole next step and set that aside for a moment and look at the future of village corporations and region in their business success. And we know that there is a real problem with job and income availability in the villages.
Yeah.
And when the breadwinner or presumed breadwinner does not have an income, it makes things extremely difficult for everybody in that family. So there's a crying need for jobs and for people to be doing something. You can't feel good about yourself if you're not actively providing something good, including for living for your family. So when villages and regions look at businesses, they need to do it by looking at whatever their plan is needs to be done with open eyes. And that's where I think there's some room for talking to villages and people in rural Alaska, in the Seward Peninsula, with something called, I like to call a business plan. What business will you be in and why will you succeed is probably the basic setting of that business plan. And somebody in those organizations need to look at, for instance, things like competition, what demand is there for your product idea or your business, what are the competitors, what are the political problems. It's a long, involved process, and it also applies to that business you talked about, graphite. Every business, as you know, needs to go through that. And when you, I just want to add here, when you do it in the business of, say, minerals, then you need to bring in somebody with knowledge of those minerals, what's going on in the world, and so on. And the regions and the villages need to do things on this level in the future to succeed in some of the business ideas.
I think that's really helpful that you have just articulated that, the steps to, or the blocks of a business plan. That's something that feeds into the purpose of my having this series of interviews, is to specifically have discussions that will hopefully be useful to people in the villages who might be looking at, what do we have in terms of income? Maybe, there's a stream of 7J income that comes through the revenue sharing that we talked about earlier. What can we do with that going forward? Can we start a business? Do we start a business locally? Do we do something in another city in the state of Alaska? Or do we partner with someone? And how do we choose our partners? Do we want to get into federal contracting like all the other ANCs seem like they're trying to do? Or do we want to do something on our own? So there's a lot of things to think through. And I would really love to have an in-person couple of days, a summit in Nome, to bring to people from those same villages that you went out to, 17 villages, have them come to know and have them be thinking about this together. And in some cases, maybe they'll be able to partner together, partner their resources, or, I don't know if that's too pie in the sky, but I like to think about how we have people, like you said, who are in the region. They don't have a lot of opportunities there, but can they build some opportunities for themselves with something like they have coming in, like their 7J? Like, how are they allocating that? Can they parlay that into a business investment? And what would be a safe investment? I mean, all business is risky, so they have all of that to consider too. If you put money into a business, it's not a guarantee that your business will be successful. You have to think about all of the competition, like you were talking about, the marketplace. Why would you be successful? But there's just a lot to think about there, and I really would like to find a way to help stimulate an economy, even if that means that maybe some of these village corporations develop a business outside of their village, but they send money home in a model like maybe we see with people from other countries that come to the US and work here and send money home. Like, that's a model that we can have, where we can have people set up a company that is sending money back home. I mean, just trying to think of other models that have worked for under-resourced communities.
Well, I see that Bering Strait's doing that to some extent, and I understand that model that they have of partnering with other people and successful companies, and yet having a home base where they can use income and as to how they want. But let me give you an example of why some of these studies and ideas are needed. Is that when I was traveling in the villages, I would say 5 out of 25 people that I talked to just on the street and here and there, and sometimes in the meetings themselves, is that somebody would say, you know what, we've got gold. We've got gold on our land. And you have to wonder and to yourself, well, what is that based on? And what is the future of that gold? First of all, how much is there? Is there enough of that resource to make sense to make a selection around that claim of having, not the claim of a gold mine, but the claim of having gold.
Right.
And so that's just an example of how people have their own perception of how things are. And the same concept applies to people that have business ideas. And I did some training, and that was one of the things that was really of interest to me, the idea of a marketing business plan, of doing that in-depth study in a real way. And I think in the same way, in that same education of courses, I really got a feeling about how important organizations are. How do organizations operate? What makes them work? What makes them run smoothly? Where the problem? There's an awful lot of material existing on organizations, because after all, that's all we're going to ever deal with regards to some of these ideas we talk about. Selections, businesses, we need to deal with people at every level.
Exactly. We strayed a little bit from some of the stuff that I was going to ask you about, which is, I mean, maybe you addressed it in part, but I want to be really explicit about it. So I have been really concerned about this notion that the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act transferred money and land into entities that are for-profit corporations. And in the history of the world, there's only a few corporations that have existed for more than 100 years. I mean, famously, there's like the British Trading Company or whatever it's called, or East India Trading Company, like companies like that that have been around for like 200 years in some form or another. And there's some banks in Europe that are over 100 years old. But I mean, a corporation isn't really meant to last in perpetuity. And, you know, I'm so intrigued by the idea that somehow land ownership has been transferred to a corporate entity where that to me puts the ownership in peril in the event that the corporate entity becomes defunct. So I raised that as an issue to you before we started to record today. So I know you've had some thoughts about it, and you probably have been thinking about it since then. So where are you at on that now?
Well, I've looked at the Claims Act, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, as an experiment in doing something different. And in the same way exactly as the United States Constitution, it was doing something for the first time in a new and different way. I look at it in the same way in terms of, as long as people support democracy and support those ideas, I think things will work out. Now, this is a unique thing in terms of land ownership in a place like the United States of America, is that there's restrictions on what can be done, not with regard necessarily to the ownership, but with regard to the stockholders being the final owners of the land, stock by stock. And when I think the corrections that were made in the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act and other federal laws changes was to fine-tune what that stock distribution formula could be. In other words, there needs to be finite stock with finite ownership in order to make this work, and to limit the continuing distribution of stock within the shareholders to their descendants, for instance. And right now, I think that's what we depend upon. If that ever changes, there'll be a lot of other changes at the same time happening. So as long as things remain stable or somewhat stable, I think this experiment can keep on working. I'm very optimistic.
So that's good, because one of the questions that I have for you that, and we're not really going in a particular order here, is how well do you think this experiment has served the indigenous people of Alaska, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act?
I think, in my own opinion, it's been served very well, because prior to the enactment of the Claims Act, the communities, villages, and natives had very poor representation. So now what happened is we have people with educations that are serving in those capacities. And so more and more people living in the villages, natives in Alaska, are being supported, and their needs are being addressed more in a better way by their own people. And I think in that same regard, the next issue we have, and I think the one that we have right now, is people are still just people, and those people with educations can spin off to their own desires, and that makes us talk about the issue of why things like our dancing, our cultural values are important, and more specifically why our language is critical, because both language and more particular, both dancing and those cultural type things, but more critically, language keeps us within the values of our ancestors. And our ancestors gave us a sharing value which allowed communities in the North to survive in a good way, even with the challenges that have already happened. And the more people diffuse and travel and move, intermarry and all that, that um, association and knowledge of the past gets thinner all the time, and we're more like living with what is taught to us in schools, and more horribly, what is taught to us by the television media.
The television and the internet.
And we have people now that are being trained by television ads more than by a lot of other things that are good. That, or for instance, just to bring a real simple one up, storytelling. I see that valuable asset of our past. And when I talk about our past, it goes somewhere between now to the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and beyond that to the first North that stepped on the continent, back to wherever our people came from. We've been developing these intersocial relations of making things work in a positive way for all these years. And now when you start to lose language, what do you have left? You have little language learners living in the villages with no connection or less connection with who they really are. And little by little, those strengths that they have will be diluted with every generation. And that brings us into the value of culture, activities, and language, more specifically language. And if you want to look at the value of language, you should also look at what other indigenous people are doing in New Zealand, Hawaii, Australia, but I don't know about that yet.
I like it. My concern is that my laptop is not going to make it much longer. So it's on its last legs. So I want to stop here, and I'm thinking maybe we should do another session to do some cleanup on anything that we missed. And then
I think that would be a good idea.
And then I'll work with the video editor on putting together the files to splice them together. So I won't do my usual ending here. We'll just stop so that I have, I can stop the recording and I can make sure I have that before